It's great to see so many people here this morning. It's 2 days of great PD ahead of us, and it's a wonderful opportunity that ACHPA's provided. So as Glenn has said, my focus for this morning is on the critical inquiry approach, and this is the fifth proposition that we see in the Australian curriculum for HPE. And in this morning's session, I just want to identify a couple of concepts and a couple of ideas that I want you to think about and take away from this morning's session. There's not a lot of time to really unpack these things, and some of the examples that I'm going to use actually tie into the propositions that we've already heard about this morning. So it's really just a chance to look at it from that critical perspective and think about our own practices. And as we move forward, you know, it has been said this morning, it's a really exciting opportunity. There's a lot of hard work ahead of us, and many of you have already been engaged in lots of hard work, but it's also a very exciting time because we can actually take this document and use it in really meaningful and valuable ways. So I'm going to spend some time just focusing on critical thinking initially, just to get our minds back into this space and looking at what that looks like. Then spend some time looking at the inquiry approach and how we actually manage that and how we facilitate it, and then bring the two together and look at, I'm going to focus on propositions 2 and 4, so the strengths-based approach and health literacy as two examples to show how we can actually engage in that critical thinking. And then finally, just finish with some challenges for you as members of this profession. So in terms of critical thinking, everyone in the room would be familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. We hear about the cognitive domain. It's something that we've learnt about over the years. The affective domain, and we also have the psychomotor domain as well. Now, the affective domain is one that's often neglected. It's not necessarily thought about as much as the cognitive domain. We actually need to think about the two in conjunction. We need to think about how they go together and how they can work in a homogeneous way. And on the left-hand side there is the cognitive domain, the right-hand side is the affective, and a summary of the different levels within those domains. And they really are presented as a hierarchy. And we have critical thinking in the cognitive domain that's up at the top end of that spectrum. Now, when we match that up with the Australian curriculum and actually have a look at some of the key words, I just spent some time going through that document, looking at the rationale and looking at specifically how some of those key words link across to the cognitive domain. We can see there researching, critical analysis, application, knowledge appraisal, critical evaluation, decision-making behaviours and actions, and they're all key words that come out of that document. The knowledge and understanding becomes an important foundation, but it's what we do at the upper end of that spectrum that's important for us. When we spent some time looking at the affective domain, as you can see there on the right-hand side, it's anything that relates to values, beliefs. When we actually start to engage from that point of view, is associated with the affective domain. We need to actually link the two together. So the HPE keywords, and I've just again highlighted some examples from the document. They're not exclusive to this domain, but I just want you to think about how they might link to it. So exploring inclusiveness, inequalities, assumptions is a pretty important one, because if we think about our motivations for becoming HPE teachers, a lot of us, in fact everyone, enjoys or has an interest in physical activity. We can often make key assumptions about physical activity, about why people might enjoy it or why they don't enjoy it, and it's necessary for us to see the full perspective, and it's necessary for our students to see that full perspective as well. Social justice is mentioned there, that's critical. Any of you who are senior health teachers would know that's an important part of the frameworks that underpin that subject. Action and developing skills and strategies. So, health behaviour. I just want to spend a bit of time now looking at health behaviour. And we've heard about the strengths-based approach and the risk-based approach as well. We can look at behaviour, and sometimes health behaviour is really obvious. It's in our face, and sometimes it's covert. And I don't know if people up the back of the room can see that image very well, but basically we have an example of a situation that would obviously breach OH&S regulations. But we've got an object that needs to be moved to the upper end, the upper level on this factory, and we've got a forklift that obviously isn't sufficient height to get up to that top level. And so the solution is we use the larger forklift to lift the smaller forklift and then use it as a way of getting the object to the top there. So hopefully we can all identify the risk in this situation. Sometimes it is obvious, but there's other times where it's not so obvious, and we can also look at it from the other perspective in terms of strengths-based approach as well. Sometimes we do good things and we exhibit good behaviours and it's clear, it's obvious to us. But other times it's not as obvious, and we need to try and understand these as part of factors that influence our outcomes and what we do in our practices. And those health behaviours are driven by determinants, and this is just a summary of what we've already heard about previously, but there's different orientations. We can have that deficit-based approach, and on the left-hand side there we've also got the asset-based or strength-based approach, which is where we focus on those protective factors, and we see them. This is really about building capacity on that left-hand side. It's about looking at what is being done well, how do we actually leverage off that and use that as ways of building capacity in other people, and it's also identifying areas where we can move forward to aspirational outcomes. And we have that overlap that exists between the two. We've seen this slide already, so I won't go right through it because we've already heard about health literacy. But just to unpack this a bit more, Don Nutbeam, health literacy is a term that's been around since the 1970s. It's not a new term, but the last 10 to 15 years there's been a different perspective placed on it. The three-dimensional model that we see here is from the work of Don Nutbeam, and I was fortunate to have Don as a critical friend for my PhD work that I've been doing. Don is Vice-Chancellor of University of Southampton in the UK, and he's a real pioneer in the area of health promotion, and this is his work. And it is a spectrum, and at the top end of that spectrum, the reason why I'm mentioning it now is that we have critical health literacy at the top. So if we're going to encourage our students to engage in critical inquiry, we need to work out ways to help them move up that spectrum themselves and identify how they can also do that with others in the community. One thing I do want to stress with this is that critical health literacy means different things in different contexts. Just because someone can type in symptoms for an illness into Google, and if someone does that and then convinces themselves that they've got some form of illness, and they start panicking and going to the doctor and saying, I've already looked up this, I know I've got this condition, they're not demonstrating critical health literacy. They probably think they are because they're going through that research process, but if they're not actually critically engaging with that information and using it to make good decisions, then they're not showing that level at the spectrum. And just to unpack a few key words there, we see empowerment, we see efficacy. Motivation's a key one there, but self-efficacy is a critical one. It's about that confidence. So not just arming young people with skills, but giving them the confidence to work with those skills, which is critical. And the World Health Organization, for that reason, has identified health literacy as a capacity-building health determinant. In fact, it's one of the prominent health determinants that WHO focuses on. Okay, so that's the critical approach. Linking that now to the inquiry approach is about investigation. It's a process-driven method. It's where we ask questions, and it's built around these questions because we want to try and find out more about things around us and why we do things and why we might exhibit certain behaviours in terms of understanding health and why people engage in physical activity or choose not to. So the inquiry questions are central to that process. It's important that we develop good questions for our students, and primary reason is that the reticular activating system in the brain switches on when we hear a question. So if you've ever had an experience in class where you've made a statement and you haven't had much of a response, and then followed it up with a question, and suddenly you get a bit more interest, you're getting RAS activation in the brain, and the reason being that it has that critical interpretive role, and it's necessary for us to try and make sense of our surroundings. So inquiry questions are critical for that process. We need to create those light bulb moments. It needs to go beyond a knowledge-driven didactic process. It's got to be one where we give them the skills to actually go out and investigate and look into things for themselves, We want to facilitate those light bulb moments. We want to give them the chance to actually say, oh, well, that's why people do this, or that's why they choose to do this. We want them to find out the answers for themselves. And they can do it through direct experience or through vicarious experience, where they learn about others and their experiences and perspectives. I'm just going to finish now by just giving you some things to think about. So the 5 propositions are interrelated, we've heard that. This morning I've talked about the importance of having that critical inquiry method and engaging that with higher order thinking. The 2 examples I've used are ways to show how that's connected. When we think about this, there's different ways we can look at it. We can think about it from learning. The central focus should be the students and their learning processes. We also need to think about it from our perspective as well, so making sure we're using good questions with our students, making sure the questions are actually embedded into our planning and that it's a core part of our business and our practice. The next point there is strands 1 and 2. There's some wonderful opportunities, and when you go back to your schools, spend time actually looking at the true strengths within your department. Actually take that strengths-based approach into your own practice and how you implement this curriculum. Look at the strengths that you have and leverage off those strengths and use it as an opportunity to learn from each other and see the areas where there's potential for improvement as true opportunities and see how you can take things to the next level. But part of that process is also recognising what you're already doing well. The final thing is to think about how we actually integrate both cognitive and affective learning so that they're not seen as separate domains. They're actually embedded together. So we get to a point where students actually, we're getting those values-based outcomes. We'll get to a point where there's more buy-in from students. They see the importance of what they're doing, those light bulb moments happening where we link those 2 together. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for your time.